A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Well, hello there. This is David McKnight, author of The Power of Zero, author of Look Before You Lerp, and author of an upcoming book with which you may take great interest. More of that in subsequent episodes. If you want to learn more about me, certainly go to davidmcknight.com. And if you would like to subscribe, feel free to do so. You will get an email every time we have a new podcast, so you'll always stay on top of all the latest from David McKnight. Today, we are going to address an oft-asked question, and it's this: to Roth or not to Roth? Should I do a Roth conversion, or should I not do a Roth conversion? Now, let's start off by saying, first of all, anyone can do a Roth conversion. All you have to do is have a money in an IRA. There are no income limitations. There's no conversion limits. You can convert all of your IRA in 1 year. If you have $10 million in your IRA, you can do it all in 1 year. There used to be income limitations. There are no longer income limitations. So even Bill Gates, don't know if he has any money in an IRA, but if he did, he could certainly do a Roth conversion. You don't have to have any earned income to do a Roth conversion. Remember, you do have to have earned income if you want to do a traditional Roth. But if you want to do a Roth conversion, you don't have to have an earned income. You can do it during retirement. It's actually not a bad time to do it. The question when it comes down to Roth conversions is, how much tax do you want to pay? Do you feel like your tax bill today will be lower or higher than it will be were you to postpone the payment of that tax? Now, I'm going to use an example today to try to drive home the point of whether one should do a Roth conversion or not. The example I'm going to do is let's assume you've got $1 million. Okay, you've got $1 million in your IRA, and you want to pay tax. And this is going to be really oversimplified. I'm going to use a basic tax rate of 20%. So let's just say that your tax rate is 20%, and you convert your IRA. Well, afterwards, you will have $800,000 sitting in your Roth account. Okay, some opponents. I think that's the opposite of proponent. Some opponents of Roth conversions will tell you that, hey, if you convert your IRA to a Roth IRA, you no longer have that full $1 million working for you. You're not going to be able to accumulate as much money over time because the full $1 million is not growing and compounding in your investment account because you paid that 20% tax. Now, I have to remind people that although on paper you have that $1 million, not all million of those dollars is really yours. You have to remember that when you decided to put money into that IRA or that 401k, you essentially entered into a business partnership with the IRS, and they are partners with you in that investment account. And guess what? As your portion of that IRA grows, their portion grows right along with it. So let's say, just to keep it nice and simple, I don't want to get into whether the tax rate I'm using is right or wrong. I'm just trying to illustrate an example here. But let's just say that 20% is the tax. Then what we know is that 80% of that IRA is yours, 20% belongs to the IRS. So you may be thinking that you're experiencing growth on the full $1 million, but really is what's happening there is you're only experiencing growth on that $800,000 because that's the portion technically that's yours. So the 20% that belongs to the IRS, that's growing right along with your money, but it's accruing to their benefit, not to your benefit. So to give you an example, if you were to convert that money to a Roth IRA, you now have $800,000 in your Roth IRA. All of that money is growing to your benefit. Is that any different than the prior scenario? In other words, when you had the $1 million in the IRA, 20% belonged to the IRS, 80% belonged to you. In that scenario, didn't you also only have 80% or 800,000 of those dollars actually working for you? In which case, so long as tax rates in the future remain 20%, the same as they are in today's example, guess what? It doesn't matter which one you do, whether you do a Roth IRA or whether you do a traditional IRA, you're going to net the same amount of money after tax. So for someone to say, for example, that if you convert your IRA to a Roth IRA, you're no longer going to have the full $1 million growing and compounding to your benefit, is not speaking from a foundation of logic, because you have to remember that when you entered into that business partnership with the IRS, that you basically agreed to allow their portion to grow right along with yours. And you have to always remember that your portion is that 80%. Now, what happens if tax rates down the road are dramatically higher than they are today? What if they're dramatically higher than 20%? What if they go up to 30% or even 40%? Well, guess what? Then you no longer have $800,000 accruing to your benefit. You have $700,000 or even $600,000, in which case you would have been better off to have converted your IRA back when tax rates were 20%, because once you get that money, that $800,000 into the Roth IRA, you don't have to worry about the rise of tax rates over time. Taxes can double. And if you're in the 0% tax bracket, as it were, then 2 times 0 is still 0. So you have to always remember that this argument that says you no longer have the full $1 million working for you is actually a fallacious argument, because in reality, even today, even though it looks like on paper you have $1 million, that $1 million is not really yours. In fact, it's hard to really say what percentage is yours until you know the tax rate that you'll pay at the moment when you withdraw that money. You really have no idea how much of that money is really yours. And guess what? It's hard to plan for retirement if you don't know how much money you have. And so that's one of the rationale behind why people like to do Roth conversions, is because they like to it's the old, a bird in the hand is worth more than two in the bush. You know what tax rates are today. You're willing to assess whether that's a tax that you're willing to pay versus postponing the payment of that tax till some point further down the road when it could potentially be higher. So always remember that it comes down to the tax rate. Where will tax rates be tomorrow? Where will they be when you retire versus where they are today? So it all comes down to the tax rate. Now, having said all that, I do believe that there is a sweet spot when it comes to Roth conversions, okay? I'm not here to tell you that if you are a doctor or a dentist or a high-income earner, that it makes sense for you to do a Roth conversion today, because you got to remember that when you add up all these taxes, let's say that you're at the 37% marginal tax bracket. Let's also say that you've got an 8% state tax. Already you're up to 45%, and you throw some other expenses on there. It might be an Obamacare surcharge, what have you. Then guess what? Now all of a sudden you're looking at a 50% tax rate. Do you really believe that tax rates when you retire, even if it's 10 years from now, will be 50% when you retire? Remember, when you retire, you have to keep in mind the tax cylinder that I always talk about. The tax system in our country works like a graduated cylinder from chemistry class. You know, your money, your earned income or conversions or what have you will flow into that cylinder. Some of it, your income will be taxed at 10%, some at 12%, some at 22%, some at 24%, some at 32%, some at 35%, and some at 37%. So you have to remember that in retirement, you are able to take advantage of the 10% tax bracket and the 12% tax bracket before you ever even get to the 22 or the 24% tax bracket. So I'm not necessarily a huge fan, if you're in a high marginal tax bracket today, to automatically forego that tax deduction, thinking that taxes will be higher than 50% when you retire. I don't know that that's necessarily a bet that I would make. When would I potentially think about doing a Roth conversion? Certainly if you're in a 10 or 12% and you've got room, well, I would say if you're in a 12% tax bracket and you've got room left in the 12% tax bracket, you're getting up into the high, close to $78,000. If you're taxable income, line 10 of your tax return, which is your taxable income, says that you have $40,000 of taxable income, well, you should very easily, without even thinking about it, be converting $38,000 to get you to the top of that 12% tax bracket. That's a no-brainer sort of a proposition. You shouldn't even think twice about doing that, because we will look back 10 years from now and say, 12%. Well, that was a good deal of historic proportions. Why did I let a year go by without maxing out my 12% tax bracket? Now, the real question becomes, how do we feel about the 22 and the 24% tax bracket? Do we feel like if we paid taxes on our Roth conversion at 22 or 24%, that 10 years from now, we will look back and say that's a good deal? Well, I think that we have to ask this question within the historical context of tax rates. You don't have to go very far back in the history of our country to find tax rates where the lowest tax bracket in that graduated cylinder was about 22%. If you go back to 1960 to 1963, the lowest marginal tax bracket was 22%, and then the highest went all the way up to 89. So the moral of the story is this: is as the highest marginal tax rate goes up, the lowest one tends to rise right along with it. I discussed in my last podcast episode how Larry Kolikoff is predicting that should we do nothing, given the fiscal gap in our country, 10 years from now, tax rates will have to rise by 51%. Spending in our country will have to go down by 35%. Well, guess what? If they choose not to mess with spending at all, that means that tax rates would have to rise even more than what he's projecting. So the question comes down to this. Do you think if you paid taxes at 22% today, that would be a good deal? Do you think 10 years from now, looking back at the 22% tax that you paid on that conversion, do you think that you spent your money wisely? Okay. So this really comes down to, if tax rates stayed level, it would probably be a mistake. You're paying 22 today, only to forego being able to pay only 10 or 12 should tax rates stay level 10 years from now. But it really comes down to this. Can we really afford as a country to be charging people only 10 or 12% on their distributions from what by that point will easily be $30 trillion of IRAs? My position is an overwhelming and resounding no. I don't think that 10 years from now, the lowest marginal tax brackets in our country will be 10 or 12. I think that they will be higher. And I think that if you paid taxes at 22%, you probably would not regret it. In fact, you would say, wow, I can sleep even more securely at night knowing that I've paid the piper and I never have to worry ever again about whether tax rates will rise dramatically, because you paid the piper and you did it at relatively low tax rates. Now, the question becomes, how do we feel about the 24% tax bracket? I've talked about this in past episodes. I feel like 22% is a good deal given history. I also feel like 24% is only 2% worse than 22%. Yet, what is the IRS doing? They're saying, last year, the 22% tax bracket ended at 165. I believe it's closer to 170 now. The 24% tax bracket ended at 315 last year. Now it's a little bit closer to 321,000. So for an extra 2%, you could protect another $150,000 or so of your IRA conversion. Okay. I think, again, looking back 10 years from now, that we will look back on that decision and say that was a good deal of historic proportions. Tax rates will never, ever be that low again in our lifetime. It was a good deal. Having said all that, it's up to you. You have to feel like, when it comes down to Roth conversions, you have to feel like that tax rate today that you pay today is going to be lower than what you pay in retirement. And that ultimately is a decision that comes down to you. You can certainly listen to my feelings on the topic. You can research it as much as you want. What I would probably do is really home in on what the fiscal condition of our country is. What is the likelihood that tax rates 10, 15 years from now will be dramatically higher than they are today? I will tell you this. If you're younger than 50, it's a no-brainer. It makes a lot of sense to pay taxes at today's historically low tax rates. Postpone the payment of those taxes. take advantage of today's low tax rate so that down the road, when you have fewer deductions and tax rates are certainly much higher than they are today, then you can look back and say, that was a good deal. I am now experiencing a tax-free retirement. So now, when does it become a no-brainer to do a Roth conversion? I recognize in that scenario I just discussed, it really comes down to a judgment call. But when is it a no-brainer? Well, let me describe a scenario for you that I've described in past episodes. And it's this. Let's say that you, in retirement, will have a $5,000 or $6,000 pension. That will cause, because that's all provisional income, that will cause your Social Security to be taxed. So we're looking at a scenario where your two sources of income, your pension and your Social Security, will entirely consume your 10 and 12% tax bracket in retirement. Then at that point, whatever's in your 401k or IRA will flow into your graduated cylinder and land right on top of all that other income, where you will then be charged 22% tax. Best case scenario. That's assuming that tax rates stay low. So let's work under that premise. Well, if you're currently in a 22% tax bracket, you should probably, given that your best case scenario in retirement is 22%, you should probably not let a year go by where you're not maxing out your 22%. And I would also probably say this, since 24 is only 2% worse, you should probably not let a year go by where you're not maxing out the 24% tax bracket by way of conversions. That's an absolute no-brainer. The best case scenario is that you will give up 22% of your IRAs or 401ks. That means you have a 78% stake in that IRA. That can only go down as tax rates go up. And as we're marching into a future where tax rates almost certainly will be higher than they are today, then it makes sense to really take a strong look at whether it makes sense to, max out your 22 and probably even your 24% tax bracket. So if you have a pension, a lot of times we say if you do have a pension, it might make sense to see if you have a lump sum distribution option. That would allow you to roll that pension, that lump sum distribution, into an IRA. You could then convert that IRA to a 401k, to a Roth IRA, in which case you could definitely get to the 0% tax bracket. And remember, in my mind, the very best way to insulate yourself from the impact of higher taxes is to get to the 0% tax bracket. Why? Because if you're the 0% tax bracket, 2 times 0 is still 0. So that is certainly a no-brainer, and there should be no discussion there if you find yourself in a position where your best case scenario is your money will flow into your tax cylinder retirement, land on top of your pension and your Social Security income, and be taxed at the 22%, or at least the future equivalent of whatever the 22% tax bracket is. And if tax rates double, that could be 44%. Let me conclude by sharing with you the story of my limousine chauffeur. Okay, so I got picked up to go to a conference in a limousine. The guy was shuttling advisors like me back and forth to the conference all day long. And he struck up a conversation with me. He knew that I was a financial advisor. And it sounds like, from what I could gather, that he was having very similar conversations with the other advisors that were driving him around. So he basically volunteered a lot of information about his financial plan. He says, look, I only work because, I want to put some lumps in the gravy. He had a pension that basically met his lifestyle needs. He maybe had another $20,000 of income. But anyway, he was squarely in the 12% tax bracket. And he had, I believe, about $1 million in his qualified plans. I can't remember if it was a 401k or an IRA. But the point is, he felt pretty happy about his situation. And he was in a 12% tax bracket and felt like if he ever decided to take money out of that 401k or IRA, he'd only pay 12%. So he basically laid all this information out as a way of demonstrating to me how careful and prudent he had been with his finances over the years. So I, of course, congratulated him. He was in an enviable position where he really had all of his expenses paid for, and he was just working, like I said, to put some lumps in the gravy and to keep himself busy. Well, I pointed something out to him that really, really got his attention. I said, look, have you ever considered what would happen if you died? And he said, well, sure, my wife would inherit my 401k or IRA. And I said, that's right. But what happens to her tax bracket if you die? And he thought about it for a second. He says, well, what would happen to it? I said, well, as a single person, the thresholds that govern the differences between, say, the 12 and the 24% tax bracket actually shrink by half. So I said, there's a good chance that if she got your pension and the taxable portion of her Social Security, that any money that she took out of her 401k or IRA at that point would probably put her in the 24% tax bracket, or sorry, the 22% tax bracket. That's almost double where you are right now. So the point I was trying to make to him is that even if you don't believe that tax rates in the future are going to be dramatically higher than they are today, you should probably look at how long a widow or widower typically remains alive after their spouse dies. If you die and your wife inherits all of your money, there's a good chance she could be alive for 8 to 10 years. And if she deigns to draw money out of those IRAs or 401ks, she'll be paying 24% tax. So my point to him was, why should you let a single year go by where you're not maxing out your 12% tax bracket? If memory serves, he had quite a bit of room in his 12% tax bracket to be doing conversions. You should be converting like crazy. I'm not saying bump up into the 22% tax bracket in your conversions, but don't let a year go by where you're not at least maxing out your 12% tax bracket, because the minute that either you or your spouse dies, okay, then the cost of being able to take money out of your IRA or 401k automatically just about doubles, okay? So not to consider the implications of what happens when you die and your kids inherit your IRAs. When that income flows to them after your death, they're going to have to realize it as income. It's going to certainly be at higher marginal tax brackets down the road. This guy was 65, if memory serves, so he could die in 20 years. So tax rates will certainly be higher 20 years from now, and your kids will be at the apex of their earning years. So these IRAs are going to flow into their tax cylinder and be taxed. Remember, the IRS forces you to take this money out. The IRS, so it'll flow into their tax cylinder and land right on top of all their other income. And there's a pretty good chance if they're at the apex of their earning years, that's not going to be a 12% tax bracket. So just by being a bit thoughtful about the current tax bracket that we're in and the tax bracket that we're likely to be in should we become single, or the tax bracket that our children are likely to be in when they inherit our IRAs, goes a long way towards helping us recognize whether it's a good time to do a Roth conversion. So that's really the main gist of the show today. Be very, very thoughtful about where your tax bracket is right now, where it is likely to be when you retire, what are the implications of dying and becoming a widow or widower, and what are the implications of passing this money on to the next generation. Remember, if you have money in a Roth IRA, then it goes to your spouse, and he or she doesn't have to worry about what tax bracket they're in. And if it goes to your children, they don't have to worry about what tax bracket they're in, because somebody already paid the piper. And guess what? If you're in the 12% tax bracket and you have room left in there, honestly, not a year should go by where you're not maxing that thing out. Anyway, thanks for being on the show today. Another reminder to subscribe. If you subscribe, of course, you'll get the show every time we have a new episode. It'll show up right in your email inbox, and that way you can stay on top of the latest from David McKnight. Again, davidmcknight.com if you want to learn more. Certainly you can buy copies of The Power of Zero, Look Before You LERP, and my soon-to-be-released title. We'll discuss that soon. Thanks again for being on the show today. We will talk to you soon.